New York City. Courtroom No. 7 a cold November morning. Suddenly, every screen in the room lit up at once. Richard's face drained of color as he shot to his feet. Objection. This is fabricated evidence. I demand this be stopped immediately. Sit down. Mr. Whitfield. The gavel struck, cold as cracking ice. But no one was looking at him anymore. Because on every screen in that room, the biggest secret of Richard Whitfield's life was destroying him, right in front of the entire court. Caroline just sat there, her hands resting gently on her stomach, the corners of her mouth curving barely, slowly. Because this woman had known that moment was coming long before he ever realized he had already lost. This is the story of a man who turned a courtroom into a weapon against his own wife, and whose biggest secret became the very thing that destroyed him. Keep watching, because the truth is more unbelievable than anything you're imagining right now. The morning they arrested my husband in open court, I was wearing a suit 2 sizes too big. I had bought it that way on purpose. I needed them to look at me and see someone who was falling apart. I needed the gallery to see exhaustion in my posture, uncertainty in the way I walked to my seat, fragility in the pale oval of my face under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. I needed the reporters in the back row to frame their mental captions around words like struggling and embattled and clearly shaken. Most of all, I needed him to believe he had already won. My name is Caroline Whitfield. I am 39 years old. I am 4 months pregnant. And the man sitting across the courtroom aisle from me that morning, the man in the custom charcoal suit with the ice blue eyes and the practiced smile of someone who has never once in his adult life been held accountable for anything. That man had spent the last 8 months trying to make me disappear. Not metaphorically, not casually, methodically, deliberately, with the kind of strategic patience that most people reserve for building things rather than destroying them. He came very close. But here is what Richard never understood about me, and what I want you to understand before we go any further into this story. Because it is the thing this story is actually about. When you spend 12 years loving someone who is slowly and methodically erasing you, piece by piece, year by year, you get very, very good at being invisible. And invisible people, they see everything. I had been invisible in that marriage for longer than I could honestly account for. I had learned to make myself small in rooms where Richard wanted to be large. I had learned to stay quiet when he needed an audience, to agree when he needed validation, to disappear when he needed space. I had become so practiced at reducing myself that by the time I finally understood what was happening, I could barely remember what the full version of me had looked like. But here is the thing about learning to be invisible. It is a skill, and skills, once learned, can be redirected. While Richard was busy performing his version of our story for judges and lawyers, and gossip columnists and friends who had known us for a decade, I was watching. I was listening. I was collecting. I was building something he could not see, because he had never once believed I was capable of building anything at all. The courtroom that morning smelled like wood polish and old paper, mahogany panels on every wall, portraits of long-dead judges staring down from their frames with expressions of permanent disapproval. The kind of room designed to make ordinary people feel the weight of institutions pressing down on them from above. I sat at the defense table in my oversized beige suit, and folded my hands on the surface in front of me and looked at nothing in particular. Richard glanced at me once when he came in. Just once. A quick, assessing look, the kind he had been giving me for 12 years whenever he wanted to measure exactly how close to the edge I was standing. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. He thought he was looking at a woman who had surrendered. He was looking at the most dangerous person in the room. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how that morning happened, and why it ended the way it did, you need to understand how it began. Not the trial, not even the divorce. You need to understand the marriage. Because the thing that destroyed Richard Whitfield was not a lawyer or an investigator or a federal marshal. It was 12 years of underestimating the woman he had chosen to stand beside him. That story begins 11 years ago. In September, at a small inn in Vermont. With white clapboard walls and a maple tree turning gold outside the window, and 37 guests gathered to watch 2 people make promises they both believed, in that moment, were unbreakable. It begins with pearl earrings and a sketchbook full of garden designs, and a 28-year-old woman standing at an altar, thinking she was the luckiest person she knew. She was, in fact, the least lucky person in that room. She just did not know it yet. Caroline Whitfield, née Morrison, had arrived at her wedding with the particular confidence of a woman who has worked hard for everything she owns and intends to keep working. She had finished her master's degree in landscape architecture the previous spring, Graduating second in her program with a thesis project her advisor called the most commercially viable student design she had seen in 15 years. She had already been offered a full-time position at the firm where she had interned, a small but ambitious practice in Boston that specialized in residential gardens and urban green space design. She had a sketchbook she carried everywhere, filled with ideas she planned to spend a career building. She was 28 years old and she had a plan for her life, and she loved her plan, and she loved the man she was marrying. And she believed, with everything she had, that those two things would grow together rather than against each other. Richard Whitfield was 31. He was handsome in the way that slightly dangerous men are always handsome. Certain of himself, commanding in any room he entered. The kind of man who, when he turned his full attention on you, made you feel like the only person on earth who mattered. He had that gift, that particular, devastating gift of making the person he was with feel chosen, special, seen in a way they had never quite been seen before. Caroline had fallen for it completely. That is not a criticism of her. It is an observation about him. He was very, very good at it. They had met at a fundraiser in Boston, 18 months before the wedding. A mutual friend had introduced them over bad wine and good appetizers, and Richard had looked at her across the conversation and said, with that careful, amused smile, that he had heard about her thesis project and that whoever designed it was wasting their time in Boston. She had laughed. She had thought he was being complimentary. She had not yet learned that Richard's compliments were always delivered with their hooks inside them. The first year of their marriage was genuinely good. That is important to say and important to believe, because what comes after only makes sense if you understand that the beginning was real. The warmth was real. The laughter was real. The sense, in the early months, of having found someone who made the world feel larger and more possible. That was real too. The second year was when the temperature began to change. It started with suggestions. They were living in New York by then, in a duplex on the Upper West Side that Richard's money had purchased. Caroline was commuting to Boston 3 days a week for work, staying in an apartment she shared with a colleague, driving back Thursday evenings on the Amtrak. One Sunday morning, Richard set down his coffee cup and said, conversationally, almost as an aside, that he had been thinking about her commute. That firm you're with, he said. They're small, Caroline. You're too talented for a practice that size. You could be doing so much more. She had agreed with him, in a general way. The way you agree with someone who is saying something that sounds like support. It had felt like encouragement. She had not yet learned to look at what was underneath his encouragements. 6 months later, during a stretch when the commute had become genuinely difficult, and she was tired in a way that had become structural, he mentioned, gently, that she did not have to do this, that he made enough, that he would never stand in the way of her work, but that if she wanted to take a step back, even temporarily, he would support her completely. She took a leave of absence. She told herself it was temporary. By the time she thought about returning, the language around the subject had shifted in ways she could not have identified precisely but felt clearly. She had become, in Richard's telling of their life, someone who was taking time for herself, someone who was exploring what she really wanted, someone who had stepped away from a career she was never fully committed to. None of that was true, but it had been said so many times, in so many variations, that she had begun to hear it in her own voice when she thought about her own past. By year 4, her sketchbook was in a box in the attic. By year 6, she had no personal bank account. All household expenses ran through a joint account that Richard reviewed each month. By year 8, she could not name a single friend she still spoke to regularly. Her college friends had faded during the commuting years. Her Boston colleagues had moved on. The social life she had now was entirely constructed around Richard's professional world, his dinners, his charity events, his carefully curated circle of people who knew him as a man of enormous success and considerable personal warmth. She did not identify any of this as a pattern. That is the most important thing to understand about how coercive control works. The temperature rises so gradually that the person inside it almost never recognizes what is happening until they are already completely enclosed by it. Looking back, years later, she could trace it precisely. But in the living of it, she had simply felt, slowly and inexplicably, like she was losing herself, like she was becoming less clear, less defined, less certain of her own perceptions. She had wondered sometimes if this was just what long marriages felt like. She had wondered if she was the problem. She had not yet considered that the problem had a name, and an architect, and a very specific set of intentions. That understanding came on a Tuesday morning in March. She found out she was pregnant. She was alone in the bathroom of their Upper East Side penthouse. They had moved there 5 years ago. into a place so large and so carefully designed that it sometimes felt to Caroline less like a home and more like a stage set. Marble floors, 12-foot ceilings, views of the park. She sat on the cold marble floor with the test in her hands and looked at the two lines and felt something she could not yet name. Not happiness, not sadness exactly. A kind of terror that seemed to come from somewhere very deep and very old. She had been trying to find the courage to leave Richard for almost a year. She had known, on some level that she had not yet spoken aloud even to herself, that the marriage was not what she had believed it was. She had sensed it in small ways and large ones. In the particular quality of the silence when she disagreed with him. In the way certain subjects seemed to be simply unavailable for conversation. In the exhaustion she felt after social events where she had smiled and nodded and performed for 4 hours without saying a single thing she actually thought. She had been gathering courage the way you gather a very small, very fragile thing, carefully, quietly, without letting anyone see. And now the arithmetic of leaving had just become devastatingly complicated. She told Richard that evening over to dinner. She watched his face across the white tablecloth, watched the slight pause, the measured shift of expression. He set down his wine glass. He looked at her. He said, "Are you sure it's mine?" The room went very still. Caroline looked at her husband and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was entirely alone, not just in that room, not just in that marriage. Entirely alone in the way that only becomes clear when someone you have trusted with your whole life shows you, in a single sentence, exactly who they have always been. She looked at him across the white tablecloth, and she did not cry, and she did not argue, and she did not perform any of the distress he was expecting. She simply said, yes, and she began, that night, to plan. 3 weeks after telling Richard about the pregnancy, Caroline found a receipt. It was tucked inside the breast pocket of a suit jacket she was preparing to take to the dry cleaner. A hotel receipt. The Carlisle. One night, 2 months ago, a Tuesday, which was the same Tuesday that Richard had told her he was at a conference in Chicago. She stood in the laundry room of the penthouse for a long time holding that small rectangle of paper. She had been in this room before, figuratively speaking. She had felt the particular tightening in the chest that comes from finding the physical evidence of something you have already half known for a very long time. She had stood in this precise emotional position and felt the pull toward confrontation, toward tears, toward the desperate attempt to extract an explanation that might make the thing she was holding make sense. She did not do any of those things. Something had shifted in her since the night she told Richard she was pregnant and watches half his face tell her everything she needed to know. Some very quiet, very cold part of her had been measuring and calculating, and it had arrived at a conclusion that now sat in her chest like a stone. Confronting Richard would accomplish exactly one thing. It would tell him that she knew, and the moment he knew that she knew, whatever advantages she currently held would evaporate. She put the receipt back exactly where she had found it. She folded the jacket with care. She placed it in the dry cleaning bag. She walked to the kitchen. Then she picked up her phone and called her college roommate, Diane. She had not spoken to Diane in 3 years. That gap was one of the things she did not examine too carefully, because examining it led to understanding it, and understanding it led to a kind of grief she was not ready to feel yet. Diane picked up on the second ring, Caroline. Her voice had the particular note of someone who is pleased and surprised and slightly worried all at once. Caroline, hi. Are you okay? I need the name of the best private investigator in New York, Caroline said, and I need you to not ask me why yet. A silence. Then, okay. Can you do that for me? Yes, Diane said. Give me 24 hours. That call took 4 minutes. When it was over, Caroline went to the kitchen window and looked out at the city that Richard owned more of than she had realized. And she made a decision that she would later describe to anyone who asked, as the moment she decided to stop being invisible in the way she had always been invisible, which was helplessly, and to start being invisible on purpose. She spent the next week quietly, carefully, systematically beginning to understand the full dimensions of what she was inside. She had been building something for 18 months already, without quite knowing she was building it. She had been underreporting the household grocery budget by $40 a week, sliding the difference into a savings account she had opened at a bank branch 15 blocks from the penthouse, at a bank Richard had no relationship with, under her maiden name. $40 a week. She had done the math once and almost laughed. Richard spent $4,000 on a bottle of wine without pausing. She had saved $3,000 in a year and a half by lying about groceries. But it was hers, and it had its own account number and its own debit card that she kept in her phone case. Behind a photo of her mother, Diane called back with a name. Samantha Holt. Not the investigator, but an attorney. a family law specialist with a reputation for being, in Diane's words, devastatingly precise. She handles cases like this, Diane said carefully, which was as much as either of them would say out loud. Caroline met Samantha at the attorney's office on a Thursday morning, telling Richard she had a prenatal appointment. Samantha was 52, quietly dressed, and had the particular stillness of someone who has heard every version of every story and is still capable of listening to each new one as though it is the first. She listened to Caroline for 90 minutes. Then she said, "Tell me about your finances," Caroline told her. When she was done, Samantha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to understand something before we go further. What you're describing is not an unusual divorce. What you're describing is a sophisticated financial control structure that has been in place for years. If you are going to walk away from this marriage with anything, and if you are going to protect the child you are carrying, you cannot move carelessly. Not a single step." "I know," Caroline said. "Can you maintain your current behavior? Act as though nothing has changed." "I have been acting as though nothing has changed for 12 years, Caroline said. "I'm quite good at it." Samantha looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I think you are." They retained each other that day. Samantha's retainer was $15,000. Caroline had $3,000. Samantha accepted $3,000 as a deposit and told her they would work out the rest. Caroline walked out of that office and into the April afternoon and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, like she had something. Not safety, not certainty, not anything she could name precisely. A foothold, the smallest possible toehold in the rock face of what was coming. It was enough to begin. On a Wednesday morning in May, Caroline was standing in the checkout line at a grocery store. She had $47 of groceries on the belt. The cashier was young, maybe 19. Moving through the items with the efficient boredom of someone who has scanned 10,000 objects this week. Caroline was thinking about a prenatal appointment she had scheduled for Friday and a conversation she needed to have with Samantha about financial disclosures. Her card declined. She tried again. The machine beeped. Declined. She apologized to the cashier. She left the cart. She walked out of the store with her pulse in her ears and her hands very steady and her mind moving very fast. She checked the joint account on her phone. Zero. Not insufficient funds. Not pending transactions. Zero. Every dollar that had been in their joint savings account, $340,000, had been electronically transferred out that morning at 9:02. She called Richard. Voicemail. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat. She called Samantha. Samantha picked up on the first ring. Caroline said, "He moved all of it this morning. 340,000. A silence. Then very quietly, "He knows, Caroline. He knows you've been building something. We need to move right now. What do? We file an emergency motion today to freeze all accounts and contest the transfer. But Caroline, I need to tell you, if he has already retained counsel and if they move this morning, that means they have been planning this for a while. This is not a reaction. This is an opening move." She drove to her sister Rebecca's apartment. Rebecca was 36, a high school art teacher. Practical and loyal in a way that had always made Caroline feel guilty for having let the friendship drift. They had not spoken deeply in 2 years. Caroline showed up at her door with a tote bag of essentials she had been quietly assembling for 3 months and said, "I need to stay here for a while." Rebecca looked at the tote bag. She looked at Caroline's face. She stepped back from the door without a word and let her in. That afternoon, a process server knocked on Rebecca's door. He was a bored-looking man in his 40s with a manila envelope and a practiced professional distance. He confirmed Caroline's name, handed her the envelope, and left. She sat on Rebecca's couch and opened it. Divorce papers, 41 pages, which meant Richard's attorney had been working on them for months, and tucked behind the divorce filing. A document that was the real point of the delivery. A temporary restraining order. The filing claimed that Caroline Whitfield posed a credible threat to the physical safety of Richard Whitfield, citing 3 specific incidents of alleged threatening behavior. All 3 incidents were dated within the past 6 months. All 3 were described in careful, clinical language that made them sound both plausible and professionally documented. None of them had happened. She was 4 months pregnant. She had not raised her voice to Richard in years. She had learned, long ago, that raising her voice accomplished nothing except giving him evidence of the instability he was already suggesting she possessed. She sat on Rebecca's couch with the envelope in her lap and felt the floor disappear beneath her. "This is the moment I need you to understand. If you understand nothing else about what was happening, because this is the move that people like Richard depend on, not the cruelty of it, though it is cruel, the arithmetic of it. In one morning, He had done 4 things. He had removed her access to any money. He had framed a false legal narrative that would define her in public record. He had obtained a legal document that restricted her movements. And he had made her afraid, not of him, of the system, of courts and filings and official language that now described her, in black and white, as a dangerous and unstable person. Rebecca sat down beside her on the couch and put an arm around her shoulders. Caroline did not cry. She stared at the wall. She thought about the sketchbook in the attic of the penthouse she could no longer enter. She thought about the pearl earrings she had worn at her wedding. She thought about a 28-year-old woman standing at an altar who had believed, completely and without reservation, that she was the luckiest person she knew. Then she picked up her phone and called Samantha. "I've been served. 41 pages in a TRO. He's claiming I threatened him." "I know," Samantha said. "We expected this. Caroline, listen to me. Do not call him. Do not contact him directly about any of this. Do not post anything. Do not discuss this with anyone who is part of his social circle. Do not make any public statements of any kind. He wants a reaction. Specifically, he wants a reaction that looks like the unstable behavior he has already described in those filings." "I know," Caroline said. "The emergency motion goes in tomorrow morning. We're going to fight the freeze, and we're going to fight the TRO. But I need you to be completely still right now." "Can you do that?" "Yes," Caroline said. She could do that. She had been doing that, in one form or another, for years. Richard's attorney was a man named Arthur Graves. She had met him once, at a firm dinner 3 years ago. He was the kind of man who occupied space with the confidence of someone who has never been surprised by anything in a courtroom. 60 years old, expensively suited, with the particular smoothness of a lawyer who has spent 3 decades making inconvenient facts disappear. His filings, when Samantha walked her through them, were a work of careful, professional fiction. They claimed Caroline suffered from severe emotional dysregulation. They claimed she had secretly transferred marital funds. They claimed the household estate manager, a man named Gerald who had worked for Richard for 9 years and received his paycheck from Richard's personal account, had personally witnessed the 3 threatening incidents that had never occurred. And at the bottom of the final page, one quiet paragraph. "Given Mrs. Whitfield's documented psychological instability, the court should consider a welfare evaluation of the unborn child." Caroline read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the filing down. She looked at Rebecca across the kitchen table. Rebecca was watching her with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to show how frightened they are. "He thinks," Caroline said slowly, "that I will sign anything to make this stop." Rebecca did not answer. "He has never understood," Caroline said, "that there is nothing he can threaten me with that is worse than becoming someone my child grows up watching choose fear over truth." She picked up her phone and called Samantha again. "I want to go to trial," she said. "I want to put every single thing he has done in front of a judge, and I want every page of it on the public record. I do not want a settlement. I do not want a negotiated exit. I want a courtroom." A pause. Then Samantha said, very quietly, "Okay, then let's build you a courtroom." 2 weeks into the legal storm, Samantha filed an emergency motion contesting the asset freeze, and they won. A federal magistrate reviewed the filings, found insufficient grounds for the freeze, and ordered the accounts partially restored. $80,000 released back to Caroline immediately, enough to fund legal costs and basic living expenses through trial. Caroline got the call standing in Rebecca's kitchen on a Thursday morning. She pressed the phone against her chest and exhaled for what felt like the first time since May. She made tea. She called Diane. She sat at Rebecca's small kitchen table and felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. Safe. For now. Breathe. She laughed for the first time in weeks. Not the careful, performed laugh she had deployed at Richard's dinners, but an actual laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than performance. That night, she slept for 6 hours. Real sleep. The kind you fall into rather than negotiate with. She woke up to 17 missed calls. The first call she returned was to her obstetrician's office. A billing coordinator. Apologetic but firm. Caroline's insurance had been canceled the previous day. Richard had removed her from the corporate health policy. Her next prenatal appointment, scheduled for Monday, was now a $4,000 out-of-pocket expense, and given the specialist monitoring her pregnancy would require, the cumulative cost going forward was something the coordinator could not accurately estimate, but suggested would be significant. Caroline sat in bed with the phone in her lap and processed this information carefully, the way she had learned to process bad news, by finding its edges before she let herself feel the center of it. Then Rebecca knocked on the bedroom door. Her face was a specific color. Not pale exactly. the color of someone who has just read something they were hoping not to have to show you. She carried her laptop into the room and set it on the bed and turned the screen toward Caroline without saying anything. It was a social column, a gossip page Caroline recognized, one of the city's most read social publications, the kind of outlet that moved in the same circles as Richard's professional life and was fed regularly by people who needed controlled narratives delivered at speed. The headline read, CEO Richard Whitfield files for divorce. Sources cite wife's erratic behavior and alleged spending scandal. There was a photograph. It had been taken 6 weeks ago, outside their apartment building. A candid shot, the kind that required either a long lens or someone standing very close. Caroline in the frame looked exhausted. Her coat was wrinkled. Her hair was loose and slightly disheveled. She was looking at something off to the side, and her expression, caught in that particular, unguarded way of a candid shot, looked uncertain and frightened. She looked, in that single image, exactly like the woman Richard's filings had described. The article was careful, vague enough to avoid defamation while specific enough to do its work. Sources close to the situation, friends who have expressed concern, a marriage that insiders say became increasingly difficult in recent years. The comments section had 340 responses. Caroline read 3 of them and closed the laptop. She walked to the bathroom. She turned on the shower. She sat down on the floor of the tub, fully dressed, and pressed her forehead to her knees. And then she did the thing she had promised herself she would not do until this was over. She broke, not loudly, not in any way that would have been visible from outside the bathroom door, but completely. The kind of breaking that comes from somewhere below the place where composure lives. Tears that were not about Richard, not about the article, not about the insurance or the photograph or the carefully worded legal fiction that was now public record. They were about the 28-year-old woman in the pearl earrings. They were about the sketchbook in the attic, and the garden designs that had never been built, and the firm in Boston she had loved, and the friends she had lost, and the 12 years she had spent becoming smaller and smaller until she was barely visible even to herself. She sat on the floor of the shower in Rebecca's apartment and let herself grieve that, all of it, every piece of it. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough. Then she felt it. A flutter. Very small. Very precise. From somewhere just below her ribs. The baby moved. Caroline pressed both hands flat against her stomach and felt the flutter again and sat very still and let it reach her all the way down through the grief. She made a decision in that moment. Not dramatically. Not with any particular ceremony. She simply decided, in the quiet and the steam and the dim light, that she was done breaking. Not because she did not have more breaking left in her. She did. She knew she did. But because there was something living inside her that was going to need her to be the kind of person who does not break, and she intended to be that person before it arrived. She turned off the shower. She got up. She dried her face. She walked out of the bathroom and picked up her phone and called Samantha. "I'm still going to trial," she said. "Nothing has changed." "I know," Samantha said. "Good. Now, I need to talk to you about someone I want to bring in." Peter Walsh was 61 years old and looked like someone's forgettable grandfather. This was, Caroline would later understand, his single greatest professional asset. He was slightly rumpled in the way of someone who has simply stopped caring about the performance of neatness, soft-spoken, the kind of face you would not retain 20 minutes after meeting it. He had spent 22 years as forensic accounting director for the Securities and Exchange Commission's New York regional office, and then spent the following 8 years as a private investigator of the particular, specialized kind who is retained when someone very wealthy has committed financial crimes and their spouse's attorney needs someone who can find money that does not want to be found. Samantha had worked with him on 3 previous cases. She called him the best in the city without any particular drama. She said it the way you say water is wet. They met in the back corner of a diner in Midtown on a Tuesday morning in June. Peter arrived before Caroline, which she noted. He had already ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He stood when she sat down and shook her hand with a firm, brief grip and then sat back down and took a careful bite of his muffin. He listened to her talk for 40 minutes without writing a single note. She told him about the joint account, the shell company name that had appeared in one of Samantha's early discovery filings, the financial patterns she had noticed over years without understanding them, the household budget discrepancies, the way Richard had restructured their joint holdings 18 months ago, citing tax efficiency, in a reorganization she had signed without fully reading because signing things Richard put in front of her had become, over the years, simply part of the rhythm of their life together. When she was done, Peter finished his muffin. He drank his coffee. he said. The money always leaves a mark. Every dollar, every transfer, every shell company. They always think they're smarter than the paper trail. They never are. Give me 6 weeks. He wrote his cell number on a paper napkin. He told her he would not bill her a single dollar until after the trial. She asked him why. He said, "Because I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've seen what guys like your husband do to women like you, and I find it professionally offensive. Also, Samantha says you're someone worth working for, and she has never been wrong about that." She thanked him. He waved it off and ordered more coffee, while Peter began his work. Caroline maintained the outward performance of someone barely keeping herself together. She attended court hearings in clothes that were slightly too large, spoke quietly, kept her eyes down at appropriate moments. Richard's attorney, Arthur Graves, watched her across courtrooms with the expression of someone who is very comfortable with the current situation. Richard, freed from the need to maintain the performance of a concerned husband, had resumed his normal life with considerable enthusiasm. He had moved his companion, a woman named Chloe Bennett, into the Hamptons estate. He attended charity dinners and golf weekends and a long weekend in Nantucket. He told his friends that the divorce was unfortunate but necessary, that Caroline had developed serious emotional problems, that he wished her only the best. His friends believed him. They had always believed him. That was what 11 years of carefully cultivated charm purchased. He did not know, because he had no reason to suspect, that the security camera he had installed in the upper corner of his private study on the Upper East Side, pointed toward his rare coin collection, was still running, still recording, still uploading automatically to a cloud server he had configured himself 3 years ago and then stopped thinking about. Caroline had found the login credentials 14 months earlier, in a notebook in his desk drawer. During an afternoon when she was looking for a pen, she had written them on a slip of paper that she kept in the phone case, behind the card for her secret bank account, behind the photo of her mother. She had never told him. She had not, at the time she found them, known exactly what she would do with that access. She had simply held on to it in the careful, instinctive way of someone who has learned to keep things that might matter later. It turned out to matter enormously. But that discovery, the full weight of what that cloud server contained, came 6 weeks after the diner meeting, on a Thursday morning in August, when Peter Walsh called her at 7 in the morning and told her to go see her doctor, not her obstetrician. Her GP, she asked why. He said, "Just do it, Caroline, today, and bring whatever prescription bottles you have from the past 3 months." Caroline had been taking an anxiety medication for 2 years. It had been prescribed by a psychiatrist, a colleague of Richard's personal physician. After a period of what both Richard and the doctor had described as significant emotional difficulty, looking back, the timing of that referral was something she would examine carefully. But at the time, she had simply been grateful for something that was supposed to help. It had not helped. If anything, the anxiety had worsened over the past 6 months. The insomnia had become structural, the kind where you lie awake at 3 in the morning with your thoughts moving too fast to follow. The panic attacks, which she had not had before starting the medication, had become a monthly and then a weekly occurrence. She had blamed the stress of the divorce proceedings. She had blamed pregnancy hormones. She had blamed herself, in the way she had learned to blame herself, for not being well enough, strong enough, steady enough. She went to her GP that Thursday morning and asked for a full panel. Blood work, everything, as Peter had instructed. She brought her prescription bottles. The doctor, a careful woman named Dr. Patricia Ng, looked at the bottles and then looked at Caroline, and then looked at the bottles again. The lab results came back 48 hours later, Dr. Ng called her on a Saturday morning and asked her to come in. She sat across the desk from her doctor in a small, sunlit office and listened as Dr. Ng explained, slowly and carefully, that the medication in the capsules contained almost none of its active pharmaceutical ingredient. The capsules appeared to have been opened and repacked. The lab analysis had identified the substitute substance as a combination of caffeine powder and a common filler compound. The active medication that was supposed to be treating her anxiety had, in fact, never been entering her bloodstream in therapeutic quantities. For months, Dr. Ng was talking. Caroline could hear her, but could not quite resolve the words into complete meaning for a moment. She was doing a different kind of calculation. Someone had opened her capsules. Someone had removed the medication. Someone had replaced it with something that would make the symptoms worse, not better. The insomnia, the panic, the shaking hands in public that Richard had pointed out with such gentle, public concern in front of their friends. She is not well. I worry about her. She had sat across from him at their own dinner table while he told their friends she was struggling, and he had known, because he had arranged it, that she was struggling, because someone had been poisoning her medication. Caroline's hands were very still in her lap. She looked up at Dr. Ng, who had stopped talking and was watching her with an expression of professional concern and something else. Something that looked almost like anger. "How long?" Caroline said. "Based on your blood levels and the prescription timeline, at least 3 months, possibly 4. 4 months." She called Peter from the parking lot. "How long?" she asked. "At least 3 months," he said. "Probably 4. I have the pharmacy records. They'll match." She sat in the car for a few minutes. The August sun was coming through the windshield and warming her hands on the steering wheel, and the world outside the car was completely ordinary. People walking to the coffee shop across the street, a man with a stroller, a delivery truck. Then she said, "Add it to the file." "Already done," Peter said. "What else do you have?" "Quite a bit," he said. "I'm coming to see you tomorrow. Bring Samantha." When Peter Walsh laid out his findings across the conference table in Samantha's office, it took him 2 hours. He had organized everything into folders, color-coded and chronologically arranged, with summary sheets at the top of each section. He walked through them without hurry, without theater, with the same quiet, systematic precision he brought to every element of his work. He had traced the Westport Capital Holdings entity from its incorporation in the Cayman Islands through 4 subsequent transactions to a network of domestic accounts held in names that, on the surface, appeared to be independent corporate entities but which shared, on examination, a single registered agent in Delaware, a single law firm in Manhattan, and a single beneficial owner whose name appeared nowhere in the filing documents but whose fingerprints, in the form of decisions and transfers and communication patterns Peter had obtained through various subpoenas, were on every page. Richard Whitfield had moved $4.2 million through this structure over 18 months. He had also, through a second layer of the Delaware entity that Peter had spent 3 weeks identifying, been quietly purchasing distressed residential properties in 3 states. Cash purchases, under LLCs with no apparent connection to him. Properties that, taken together, represented a portfolio worth approximately $6 million, none of which would appear in any marital asset disclosure. Richard had not simply been hiding money from his wife. He had been building a second life to walk into after she was gone, a quiet life. Untouchable. Far from the proceedings that were supposed to divide their assets fairly, he had been designing her erasure for nearly 2 years before he ever filed a single paper. Caroline sat across the conference table from Peter and listened and made notes and did not speak for a very long time. Then Peter opened the final folder. This one contained transcripts and timestamps from the cloud server attached to the security camera in Richard's private study. He had accessed it remotely, with the credentials Caroline had provided, and had been monitoring the footage since July. He had selected 12 segments, totaling approximately 40 minutes of recordings. He placed the printout of the transcript in front of Caroline. She read it. She read it a second time. Then she put it down and looked at Samantha. Samantha said, very carefully, "The medication tampering, combined with these recordings, constitutes criminal conduct. We have an obligation to notify the appropriate authorities. And we will. But the question right now is how we present this in the civil proceeding. How we use it in a way that is both legally permissible and strategically optimal." "He recorded himself," Caroline said. "His own system." Peter confirmed. "His own cloud server. You had authorized access. The recordings are legally obtained. He recorded himself talking about tampering with my medication, about the financial fraud, about what he expected the outcome of the trial to be. He recorded himself doing all of those things." Samantha said. "Yes," a silence. Caroline thought about the moment in Rebecca's shower. The floor of the tub, the steam, her forehead against her knees, the flutter of the baby moving. Just slightly, in the dark, she thought about a 28-year-old woman standing at an altar with pearl earrings and a sketchbook full of garden designs she was going to build someday. She said, "We go to trial." In the weeks that followed, 2 former household employees came forward. Gerald, the estate manager whose name appeared in Richard's filings as a witness to events that had never occurred, had been approached quietly by Peter with documentation of what he had been asked to fabricate. He had agreed to cooperate. The second employee, a household assistant who had left their employ 18 months earlier, had similarly been approached and had similarly agreed. Both of them had signed statements. Both of them had met with a prosecutor from the federal district. By September, Caroline had the following: cloud footage from Richard's own security system, banking records obtained by subpoena showing the full scope of the Westport Capital structure, lab confirmation of the prescription medication tampering, flight manifests and hotel records placing Richard and Chloe Bennett together in 4 cities, all billed as business expenses. A diamond bracelet worth $127,000 purchased in Paris and recorded in the Westport Capital accounts as client entertainment. Testimony from two former household employees who had originally been paid to lie. Samantha reviewed everything over 2 days. She called Caroline on a Sunday evening. "This is it," she said. "This is everything we need. We are ready." Caroline was sitting by Rebecca's window, looking at the city lights. She let herself, just for a moment, imagine what it would feel like to be free. The phone rang again. Unknown number, a doctor's voice. Results from the previous day's prenatal appointment. Something she needed to come in and discuss in person. Judge Margaret Caldwell was 63 years old and had spent 30 years on the bench, most of them in family court and civil matters, the last 12 in the Manhattan Supreme Court. She had steel gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain, and a reputation for having precisely zero tolerance for courtroom theater of any kind. She had seen, in 3 decades, virtually everything that human beings are capable of doing to each other in the context of a marriage dissolving. She was about to see something she had not seen before. Caroline dressed carefully that morning. She had selected the suit weeks ago, the same way Richard selected his suits, with intention, beige, off the rack, slightly too large. She pulled her hair back simply, no jewelry. She left the pearl earrings on the dresser in Rebecca's spare room. Rebecca drove her. They did not talk much. At the courthouse steps, Rebecca grabbed her hand and held it for a moment. "You don't have to do this quietly," Rebecca said. "Yes, I do," Caroline said. "That's exactly what I have to do." She went through the heavy doors alone. Courtroom 304 was a room built to make people feel small. Dark mahogany walls, vaulted ceiling, the portraits of long-dead judges in their heavy frames. Richard was already at the plaintiff's table when she entered. He was immaculate. The charcoal suit, the ice blue tie, the expression of a man who is braced for an unfortunate formality that will soon be behind him. He looked at her when she sat down. The oversized suit, the pale face, the tired eyes, the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. Arthur Graves opened for the plaintiff. He was theatrical in the particular way of attorneys who have never lost. He spoke for 40 minutes. He painted Richard as a long-suffering husband. He introduced the psychological evaluation, which Samantha would later show had been produced by an evaluator paid $18,000 in consulting fees by Richard's firm 2 months prior. He referenced the financial records that showed, in Richard's telling, suspicious transfers made by Caroline from joint accounts. He looked at Caroline twice during his opening. His expression, both times, conveyed the easy contempt of a man who believes the conclusion is already established. When he sat down, Judge Caldwell looked toward the defense table. Samantha said, "The defense waives its opening statement." The gallery murmured. Caldwell's eyebrow rose a fraction. Richard leaned toward Graves and whispered. Graves smiled and whispered back, "She has nothing. She is already folding." Richard took the stand for direct examination. He was a magnificent liar. He had the gift. The slight pause before difficult answers that suggested genuine pain rather than calculation. The way his eyes went soft when he talked about trying to help his wife through her difficulties. The one moment near the end, when he pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and collected himself, that made 2 people in the gallery look at Caroline with visible pity. Caroline looked at the table. She did not need to look at him. She had heard everything he was saying before, in various forms, across various settings. She had helped him practice it, in a way, by giving him the performance he needed to believe it was working. When Graves concluded his direct examination, Samantha stood, buttoned her blazer, picked up one slender folder, and walked to the podium. She did not pace. She did not raise her voice. She walked with the relaxed certainty of someone who has read the ending and simply needs to get there efficiently. "Good morning, Mr. Whitfield." "Good morning. You described yourself today as entirely transparent about marital finances. Is that accurate?" "Completely." "Let us talk about Westport Capital Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. Is that a name you recognize?" The pause was 1.4 seconds. Only someone watching for it would catch it. "It is a standard corporate tax vehicle." "A tax vehicle," Samantha said, as though considering this. "On March 3rd of last year, $4.2 million was transferred from your joint marital savings into Westport Capital Holdings. You disclosed this in your financial filing as a commercial real estate investment." "Correct, correct." Defense Exhibit 14. She walked the document to the clerk. "Bank records obtained by subpoena from the Cayman National Bank, Mr. Whitfield. These records show that 48 hours after that transfer, $3.9 million was wired to a private account in Zurich, Registered to one Chloe Bennett. Who is Chloe Bennett? Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A consultant. International logistics. $3.9 million is a substantial consulting fee. It is a retainer. Defense Exhibits 15 through 28, Samantha said, without pausing. Flight manifests, hotel reservations, and credit card records, Mr. Whitfield. Is it true that Ms. Bennett accompanied you to Paris in October, to Martha's Vineyard in August, to Nantucket in June? Business travel. Is it standard business practice to reserve single one-bedroom ocean view suites for yourself and your logistics consultant? Graves. Objection. Badgering. Caldwell. Overruled. Answer the question. We sometimes shared accommodations to reduce. Defense Exhibit 29. Samantha slid a document across without breaking her rhythm. A diamond bracelet. $127,000. Purchased at a Paris jewelry house. Recorded in the Westport Capital accounts as client entertainment. Which client was being entertained? Mr. Whitfield. The gallery was very still. Richard said nothing. Samantha let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, Your Honor, the defense requests permission to introduce Exhibit 42. It is an audiovisual file requiring the use of the courtroom monitors. Graves shot to his feet. Objection. We have no prior knowledge of this exhibit. It was submitted to the clerk at 8 this morning under seal. Counsel has it in the supplemental binder on his table, the one he has not yet opened. Judge Caldwell looked at Graves. Graves opened the binder. His face went very still. The file, Samantha continued, holding up a small silver drive, is a recording from the security system installed in the plaintiff's own primary residence, a system he personally configured. It directly impeaches his testimony regarding fidelity, financial transparency, and his characterization of Mrs. Whitfield's mental and emotional state. It also contains statements materially relevant to potential obstruction of justice and criminal conduct. Caldwell studied the drive. She looked at Richard. Richard looked like a man who has just realized the building he is standing in has no exits. I will allow it, Caldwell said. Bailiff. The screen descended from the ceiling. The courtroom went completely quiet. The timestamp appeared, October 19th, 11:52 in the evening. Richard's private study. Richard pouring scotch. Chloe Bennett on the leather sofa, wearing Caroline's silk robe. Chloe's voice came through the speakers. Are you sure Graves can keep the judge on board? Richard's voice. Caldwell is a problem, but the financial referee Graves uses for asset arbitration is where the real decision gets made. The arrangement has been in place since August. The gallery went silent in a way that had texture and weight. Richard on screen. The Westport layer is completely clean. If her lawyers reach the domestic ledgers, they will find nothing. Chloe. She still looks terrible, though. She is shaking all the time. Richard. She has been off her real medication for 4 months. I have been emptying the capsules and refilling them. She thinks she is losing her mind. She is terrified. By the time she walks into that courtroom, she will not look like a plaintiff. She will look like a patient. A sound moved through the gallery. Not quite a gasp. Something older and more visceral than a gasp. Richard on screen. And the baby makes it even better. Caldwell will want this resolved. She will award me the estate just to make it go away. The screen went dark. For a full 4 seconds. No one in courtroom 304 made any sound at all. Then Judge Caldwell set her pen down on the bench in front of her with the careful deliberateness of someone who is choosing each movement with precision. Arthur Graves was sitting motionless at the plaintiff's table, both hands flat on the surface, staring at nothing. When Caldwell spoke, her voice was the quietest it had been all morning. That made it more frightening than anything louder would have been. Mr. Graves, do you wish to make a statement before I refer this transcript to the State Ethics Board, the Federal Prosecutor's Office, and the New York Bar Association? Graves rose. Your Honor, my client has repeatedly misrepresented material facts to this court and to counsel. I move to withdraw from this representation. You are not withdrawing from anything, Caldwell said. Sit down. He sat. She turned to the witness stand. Richard Whitfield sat in the witness chair. The custom charcoal suit, the ice blue tie, the practiced expression, usually so reliable, now entirely absent. What was underneath it was something Caroline had never seen on his face before. He looked like a person who has forgotten how to breathe. Caldwell said, Mr. Whitfield, you are currently under oath. You have just been presented with a recording in which you admit to financial fraud, systematic tampering with your spouse's prescription medication for a period of at least 4 months, and discussing coordination to influence the outcome of legal proceedings. Your wife is pregnant. She is sitting in this courtroom. She has been, by your own recorded admission, being deliberately harmed. She paused. "Do you have anything to say?" The silence in the courtroom was total. Then the side door opened. 3 federal marshals walked in. They cuffed him at the witness stand. Richard did not fight. He did not speak. He stood when they asked him to stand and put his hands behind his back and let them put the restraints on with the blank, evacuated expression of a man whose internal architecture has simply given way. Caroline watched. As they walked him past the defense table toward the side door, he looked at her. It was involuntary, she thought. Not a choice. The kind of look that happens before you can decide whether to make it. She did not look away. She did not smile. She did not perform anything for him. She looked at him with clear, level eyes, and she watched him walk out of her life, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was nothing dramatic at all, not triumph, not relief exactly, something quieter. The particular stillness that arrives when something that has been requiring enormous effort for a very long time simply stops. Judge Caldwell spoke for 11 minutes. She granted Caroline sole ownership of all marital properties. She ordered an immediate freeze on all domestic and international accounts, including the Westport Capital Structure and the Delaware LLC holdings, pending federal investigation. She awarded compensatory damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress and documented medical harm. She also, at the end of her ruling, formally requested that the State Attorney General's office open a criminal investigation into the prescription medication tampering, noting in language that was characteristically precise that the deliberate and sustained interference with a person's prescribed psychiatric medication, designed to create the appearance of mental instability for the purpose of influencing legal proceedings, was in her 30 years on the bench among the most coldly calculated acts of cruelty she had encountered in a courtroom. When she was done, she looked over the rims of her reading glasses directly at Caroline Mrs. Whitfield. "Are you all right?" A small silence. "I will be," Caroline said. Caldwell nodded once. Slowly. "Yes," she said. "I believe you will." Rebecca was waiting on the courthouse steps. The November sky was doing something complicated, partly overcast and partly bright. The kind of indeterminate November light that cannot quite decide what it is. Cold enough that Caroline could see her breath. Warm enough in the direct patches of sun that the cold did not reach her. She came through the heavy courthouse doors and stopped at the top of the steps and stood there for a moment, not waiting for anything, just standing, letting the cold air come at her face. She had been in rooms for so long. Enclosed spaces, the penthouse, the courtrooms, Rebecca's apartment, the particular, suffocating enclosure of a life that someone else has designed around you. The open air was something. Rebecca came up beside her. She did not say anything at first. She just stood next to her in the way that the best kind of people stand beside you, not filling the space but sharing it. After a while, Caroline put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved. A deliberate, clear movement. Nothing like the early flutters. Present, definite. "Hey," Caroline said softly, looking down. "We made it." She didn't cry. She breathed. Then, after a moment, she took out her phone. She had looked up the number the week before, during a quiet evening at Rebecca's kitchen table. She had looked up the firm in Boston she had interned at 11 years ago. During the year, she had finished her master's degree and believed the future was wide open and she was the luckiest person she knew. The firm was still there. Different address, 3 times larger than it had been, but the same name. She found the number. She stared at it for a while. Then she put her phone away and thought about it for a week. Standing on the courthouse steps in the November light with Rebecca beside her, and the baby moving and the sound of the city all around her, she took the phone back out. She dialed. It rang 3 times. A woman answered. "My name is Caroline Whitfield," she said. "I don't know if anyone there would remember me. I interned with your firm about 12 years ago. I have a master's degree in landscape architecture. I've been out of the field for a while." She paused. "I have some designs I've been working on, just for myself, over the past few months. I was wondering if I could come in sometime." A pause on the other end. Then the woman said she would check with the partners and take down her number. Caroline gave her number. She thanked her. She hung up. Rebecca was looking at her. "The firm in Boston," Caroline said. "The one I left." Rebecca's expression shifted into something careful and wondering. "The landscape one. You called them." "I did." "Caroline, I know." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your sketchbook is in a box. In your attic. I know where it is. I'm just saying, when you go back for your things." "I know where it is," Caroline said again, and she smiled. Not the performance of a smile. Not the careful, social, dinner party smile she had deployed for 12 years in rooms where she did not belong. The real one. The one that belonged to a 28-year-old woman who had a sketchbook full of garden designs and believed the future was wide open. She was 39 years old now. She was 4 months pregnant. She was standing in cold November air outside a courthouse where the man who had spent 8 months trying to erase her had just been walked out in handcuffs. She had a case to settle, a baby to prepare for, a body to heal from months of deliberate medical harm, and a life to rebuild from its actual foundations rather than the false ones someone else had constructed for her. She had a lot of work to do. She felt, with a clarity that surprised her with its completeness, entirely ready to do it. There is something I want to say directly to you before this story ends, because I think it is the thing the story is actually about. Underneath everything else, Caroline Whitfield won her case. She kept her assets. She is raising her daughter, who was born in February, healthy and entirely herself. The landscape firm called back 3 days after that courthouse phone call, and she went in, and she took her sketchbook. And the rest of that part of the story is still being written. Richard was indicted on 7 federal counts including wire fraud, financial fraud, and criminal interference with prescribed medication, which carries its own particular weight as a charge. Arthur Graves was disbarred. The financial referee, whose arrangement had been in place since August, cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. But here's what I want you to take from this. Not the legal outcome, not the video reveal or the courtroom moment or the cuffs at the witness stand. It is this. The thing that saved Caroline was not the lawyer. It was not the investigator. It was not even the recording from a security camera that Richard himself had installed and then forgotten. It was a single decision, made in the worst moment. On the floor of a shower, in the dark. The decision to choose precision over panic. She was at the bottom. She had been systematically isolated from her money, her friends, her career, her health, and her sense of her own perceptions. She had been publicly humiliated and medically harmed and legally maneuvered into a position where every institution she tried to reach for seemed to confirm the story someone else was telling about her. And in that moment, instead of reaching outward in panic, she went inward in precision. She made a list. She made a call. She took a step. If you are in a situation right now where someone is making you feel like you are losing your mind, please hear this. That feeling of unreality, the exhaustion, the sense that you cannot trust your own memory or your own perception. It can be manufactured. It is manufactured, and it can be dismantled. Document what you can. Tell one trusted person. Find one attorney. Take one step. You do not have to be ready. You do not have to be certain. You do not have to be strong in any recognizable way. You just have to begin. The 28-year-old woman with the pearl earrings and the sketchbook full of garden designs is still there. She was there the whole time. She was not lost. She was just waiting for someone to stop performing for the wrong audience and start building for the right one. That is what Caroline did. That is what you can do, one step at a time, in whatever direction leads away from the person who is telling you that you are less than you know yourself to be. Begin.